Hello. In this series of short talks, I'm going to consider that perennial Christian subject of sin. How do I understand my sin in light of God's love? And what does God do with my sin? Why do I sin? Why does God permit me to sin? Sin is something that we're going to consider a lot in this next week as we approach Holy Week. And the way to understand this, or the way to begin to start to understand it, is to look at what the Church gives us in her liturgy. In particular, I think it's the Exalted that the deacon sings at the Paschal Vigil. The deacon brings in the lighted candle into the darkened church, and there, in light of that candle and to that candle, he sings wondrous things. He heaps up titles upon titles and themes upon themes around that light. When he comes to the subject of sin, he says this passage which I've always found very poignant. He sings, "O wonder your humble care for us. O love, O charity beyond all telling, to ransom a slave you gave away your son. O truly necessary sin of Adam, destroyed completely by the death of Christ. O happy fault, though earned so great, so glorious a Redeemer." Necessary sin, happy fault of Adam and of all the children of Adam. My necessary sin and my happy fault. How am I begin to understand that? Well, to understand mysteries, to heed them as mysteries, we never really come to one decisive answer. What we do, it seems to me, is to pile up things, pile up more and more and more. Ideas, resolutions, counter-resolutions, and we never come to any point of stasis, we never come to any point of completion, because that would to stop it being a mystery. One of the greatest theologians, I think, who's spoken on the mystery of sin is an English theologian, a woman theologian. She probably couldn't even read and write. We know her not by her own name, but by the name of the church next to which she lived. We know her, of course, as Julian of Norwich. She lived in that most barbaric of centuries, the 14th century, where there were plague and war and heresy, and it was a mess. The life of the church was a mess. 2 or 3 claimants to the papacy. The whole thing was horrific. And in the middle of that horrific century, she thought she was dying. She called for the priest, and the priest came and held a crucifix to her eyes. And there he set it, and it remained there for the course of a day and a night and the next part of the day. And in the course of what she thought was her deathbed, she asked to be able to understand the mystery of the sufferings of Christ. And as she gazed upon the crucifix, she was given what she called showings. Things were shown to us. Things were shown to her. And in those showings came revelations from God. And the revelations were about God's love, the mystery of sin and the mystery of God's love. When she recovered, she caused what she'd seen and understood to be written down quickly. And then she became an anchorite, a hermit, locked away next to St. Julian's Church. And 20 years later, minus 3 months, she says, she wrote down a long account of what she's seen and understood. And in that, in fact, read it and read it and read it. You'll never tire of it. In that, she asks lots of things, but she says, why sin? Why do you allow sin? You who are all love. And God says to her, because sin is behovely, he says, because sin is appropriate, it's fitting, it's necessary. If she can't understand this, and she asks again, it's a beautiful dialogue of question and response. And the responses, when they come, again, don't fit and finish and clearly designate the end to an argument. What they do is pile more and more and more things on. That's its beauty. And that's why it's real living theology. She asks to understand this more clearly. And right in the centre of her work, she writes about, this is chapter 51 following, she writes about a lord and a servant. The great lord is sitting there, and his servant is standing next to him. And he sends his servant to do his bidding. And the servant rushes headlong to do his master's bidding, the Lord's bidding, into the world, rushing headlong, galloping away. And he trips and tumbles into a ditch. And there he is completely alone. No one can hear him. No one can see him. His limbs are damaged. He can't get out. And he's more upset because he can no longer do his master's bidding. And then the Lord, the master, goes and finds him and brings him back and tends his wounds and his bruises and loves him. Now that is how we understand God's response to us in the world. You see, that servant is Adam, but that servant is also Christ. And as Adam fell from the garden, so Christ fell from bliss into the Virgin's womb, chasing after us, because he loves us. Because God has chosen for his dwelling the human soul. So when we sin, there's no anger in God, there's no wrath in God, there's no frustration in God's will. When we sin, God lifts us and tends to us, and he can be courteous towards us and humble towards us. This is God's response to his beloved's fall. And then what would our response be to that? We never want to sin again, not out of fear, but out of love. And yet when we do sin again, even mortally, again, the Lord rushes to us to lift us higher than we were before, because we are to be the crown of Christ, the joyful crown of Christ in heaven, because God has chosen to dwell within my soul, precisely in its inability, its weakness, its fragility, its poverty. You see, the church is a hospital. We come with broken limbs and wounded limbs to be healed and washed and fed. And the wounds that are afflicted upon us through our recklessness and from the deceits of the liar, the devil, these wounds, when they're washed and clean, are our battle scars of honour. Sin and the love of God is a great mystery. To ransom a slave, you gave away your son. Truly necessary sin and happy fault that earns so great, so glorious a Redeemer. God bless.